The city was my masterpiece. From the 42nd floor, it sprawled out before me, a glittering tapestry of ambition and light. Each skyscraper was a monument to someone's will, each pinprick of light a life unfolding. My penthouse was more than just an apartment. It was a declaration. A declaration etched in floor-to-ceiling glass, polished concrete, and the quiet hum of a climate control system that always kept the air at a perfect 68 degrees. I had built this sanctuary not with bricks and mortar, but with 16-hour workdays, with holidays spent staring at spreadsheets, with a relentless, clawing ascent up a corporate ladder slick, with the pleasantries of those who believed I didn't belong. I remember the early days, the tiny, damp apartment with plumbing that rattled like a dying man's last breath, the diet of instant noodles and lukewarm coffee, the gnawing, ever-present fear of failure. I had sacrificed my youth, my friendships, my very self at the altar of success. And this penthouse, this glorious, silent expanse of steel and glass, was my reward. It was my fortress of solitude, my testament to a decade of saying no to everything but work. The silence was the point. It was a commodity more precious than the Italian marble in my bathroom or the Scandinavian furniture in my living room. It was the silence of a life earned, a peace bought and paid for. But the world, as it so often does, refused to respect the sanctity of my silence. The intrusion, as always, came in the form of a phone call from my mother. "Elara, darling," she began, her voice a confection of sweetness I had long ago learned to distrust. "We're having a little family dinner on Sunday to celebrate Chloe's wonderful news." I closed my eyes, the skyline blurring into a watercolor of neon and dusk. "Of course," I said, the words a familiar surrender. "I'll be there." Chloe, my younger sister, a beautiful, chaotic creature who drifted through life on a cloud of charm and parental subsidy. Where I was a straight line, she was a kaleidoscope of fleeting passions, half-finished art projects, and financial crises that, more often than not, I was expected to resolve. The wonderful news, I knew, was her engagement to Liam, a man whose primary personality trait was his trust fund. Sunday dinner was an ambush disguised as a meal. The scent of my mother's roast chicken, usually a comfort, was cloying, thick with unspoken expectation. The air in my parents' suburban home was heavy with the weight of a conversation I didn't want to have. Chloe, radiant and oblivious, was brandishing her engagement ring, a diamond so ostentatious it seemed to weigh down her delicate hand. "We're so thrilled," my mother cooed, her eyes shining with a vicarious triumph. "A proper wedding, a proper start to their lives together." My father, a man who equated pronouncements with wisdom, cleared his throat. "And we've been talking about the best way to give them that start," he said, his gaze landing on me with the subtlety of a dropped anvil. A familiar knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I knew this conversational gambit. It was the gentle, circling approach before the kill. "Your apartment, darling," my mother said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if we were discussing a surprise party instead of a hostile takeover of my life. "It's perfect." The clink of my fork against the plate was a gunshot in the sudden silence. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "What about my apartment?" "Well, Chloe and Liam need a place to live," my father said, his tone one of pained reasonableness, as if explaining basic arithmetic to a particularly slow child. "And you have all that space. It's just sitting there, empty most of the time while you're at the office." "It's not empty," I said, the words precise and cold. "I live there." Chloe, who had been admiring her ring as if it held the secrets of the universe, finally deigned to join the conversation. Her voice was a practiced, breathy pout. "But Lara, you don't need a penthouse. It's just you. We're starting a family. Think of the space for the children. It would be the most amazing wedding gift." The audacity of it stole my breath. The sheer, unvarnished entitlement. They hadn't come to ask. They had come to inform. They had looked at the single greatest achievement of my life, the physical manifestation of my sweat and sacrifice, and had seen nothing more than a vacant lot, a convenient solution to their problem. "You're never there," my mother added, her voice taking on a wheedling tone. "You work so much, it's a waste. This is for family, Elara. It just makes sense." It made sense. The cold, brutal logic of it was a slap in the face. My life, my choices, my sacrifices, they were all subordinate to the needs of the family, to the whims of my sister who had never sacrificed anything. "No," I said. The word was a stone dropped into a still pond. It was quiet, but the ripples it created were immediate and profound. My father, a man unaccustomed to being denied, blinked. "No." "No," I repeated, and this time the word was not a stone but a shard of glass. It was sharp, and it was meant to cut. "The answer is no." I turned my gaze to Chloe, her face a mask of bewildered indignation. "You think this place was just sitting here waiting for you. While you were flitting from one music festival to another, I was working. While you were taking gap years to find yourself on Dad's dime, I was taking on extra projects to make rent on a shoebox apartment that smelled of mold and desperation. I ate instant noodles for years, Chloe. I wore clothes from thrift stores. I missed every holiday, every wedding, every birthday, because I was building a career that would allow me to have that space." My eyes found my parents, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning anger. "And you watched me do it. You called me a workaholic. You told me I needed to get out more to be more like Chloe. But you were happy to cash the checks I sent when your investments went south. You never once said, 'Elara, you've earned this.' You never once acknowledged the cost. But now, you see my life's work as a resource to be plundered, a convenience to be handed over to the child who has earned nothing." Chloe's eyes, those wide, innocent pools of blue, filled with tears. "You're so selfish," she whispered, the word a poisoned dart. "I'm your sister." "Being your sister doesn't make you entitled to my life," I shot back, the rage a cleansing fire. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping against the polished floorboards. "My penthouse is not a wedding gift. It is not a spare room. It is not a family asset. It is mine. You want a penthouse, Chloe? Go work for it." I didn't wait for the inevitable explosion. I walked out of the house, the slam of the front door a final, satisfying punctuation mark. As I drove back to the city, the anger began to recede, replaced by a strange, exhilarating calm. The lines had been drawn. The battle had been joined. Stepping back into my apartment, I locked the door, the solid click of the deadbolt a sigh of relief. The city lights glittered, a silent, knowing audience. They weren't just lights anymore. They were a crown. My crown. This wasn't just a fortress. It was my home. And for the first time, I felt the fierce, protective love of a queen for her kingdom. The price of my peace was the stunned, wounded silence of my family. And as I stood there, bathed in the glow of my hard-won kingdom, it felt like a bargain. The sense of victory was a heady, intoxicating thing. For a week, I moved through my life with a newfound lightness. The air in the penthouse seemed clearer, the view more expansive. I had stood my ground, defended my territory, and in doing so, had redrawn the boundaries of my own life. The silence from my family was a balm, a welcome respite from the constant, low-level hum of their expectations. I believed the matter was settled. I believed that my no had been heard, and that, however grudgingly, it had been accepted. I was wrong. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. It was thick, cream-colored, and bore the letterhead of a law firm I didn't recognize. My first thought was that it was some kind of mise-delivered mail. My second, a flicker of unease, was that it was a new, more formal attempt at negotiation. I slid it open with a silver letter opener, a gift to myself on the day I closed the deal on the penthouse. The paper inside was heavy, official. The words, arranged in dense, numbered paragraphs, were a language I understood all too well. The language of contracts, of obligations, of threats. My blood didn't just run cold, it turned to ice. The document was a formal demand for payment. It stated that the substantial sum of money my parents had given me for the down payment on my apartment, the money they had presented with tearful speeches about how proud they were of me, the money I had accepted as a gift, was, in fact, a loan. An interest-free loan, the document generously conceded, but a loan nonetheless. And it was payable on demand. I sank onto a leather ottoman, the city skyline outside my window seeming to mock me with its indifferent beauty. My mind raced back 5 years, to the day I signed the final papers for the penthouse. My parents had been there, beaming. They had presented me with a thick folder of documents, a mix of congratulatory cards, bank drafts, and what they had called formalities. I had been so overwhelmed, so exhausted from the months of searching and negotiating, so utterly consumed by the magnitude of my achievement, that I had signed where they told me to sign. I vaguely remembered a document that looked like this one, a dry, legalistic thing that I had assumed was just part of the process, a way for them to formalize the gift for tax purposes or some other arcane financial reason I didn't have the energy to question. It hadn't been a formality, it had been a weapon held in reserve. The document was ironclad. My signature, clear and confident, was on the dotted line. They were calling in the loan, the full amount, a sum so large that I couldn't possibly produce it without liquidating everything I owned, without selling the penthouse. The betrayal was a physical thing. It was a hand squeezing my heart, a vice tightening around my lungs. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a disagreement. It was a declaration of war. The family dinner hadn't been a request. It had been an ultimatum. My refusal hadn't been the end of the matter. It had been the trigger for the next stage of their attack. They hadn't asked for my home. They had laid a legal claim to it. They had planned this. They had armed themselves, years in advance, for the possibility that I might one day defy them. My mother's sweet voice on the phone, my father's pompous speech about family, Chloe's crocodile tears, it was all a performance. A carefully orchestrated charade designed to maneuver me into a position where I had no choice but to surrender. They hadn't just been entitled. They had been predatory. For a long time, I just sat there, the legal notice in my hand, the silence of my apartment no longer a comfort, but a suffocating weight. The city outside my city felt alien. The life I had so meticulously built felt like a house of cards, about to be blown down by the calculated malice of the people who were supposed to love me most. The shock, when it finally receded, left behind something cold and hard and unfamiliar. The Elara who had cried in her shoebox apartment, the Elara who had felt a pang of guilt for every missed family dinner, the Elara who had, on some level, still craved her parents' approval, that Elara was gone. She had been burned away by the searing heat of their betrayal. In her place was someone else, someone I recognized from the boardroom, someone who knew that in a war you don't play defense. You attack. My hands were steady as I picked up my phone. I didn't call my mother to scream or my father to plead. I didn't even call my own lawyer, a man who specialized in real estate and would have advised compromise and negotiation. I called a number I had been given once by a mentor, a number you only called when you were in the kind of trouble that couldn't be solved by following the rules. The name on the other end of the line was Anya Sharma. Her specialty was not family law. It was corporate warfare. She was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to burn your opponent to the ground, salt the earth, and dance on the ashes. Ms. Sharma, I said, my voice as calm and even as if I were scheduling a routine business meeting. My name is Elara Vance. I have a problem, and I believe you're the one to help me solve it. I explained the situation, my voice devoid of the emotion that was churning inside me. I laid out the facts, the penthouse, the gift, the demand letter. I could hear her listening, a focused, predatory silence on the other end of the line. When I was finished, she said one thing. They want a war, Ms. Vance. The question is, do you have the stomach for it? A cold smile touched my lips. I looked out at the city, at the glittering towers of power and ambition. It was my city. This was my home, and I would not be moved. Ms. Sharma, I said, my voice a low, dangerous thing. They have no idea what I have the stomach for. The meeting with Anya Sharma was not in a stuffy, wood-paneled office. It was in a minimalist, art-filled loft in a part of the city that was more grit than glamour. The space, like the woman herself, was sharp, modern, and devoid of unnecessary sentiment. Anya was a vision in charcoal gray, her black hair cut in a severe geometric bob. She moved with a coiled energy, a predator in her natural habitat. She didn't offer condolences or platitudes. She offered a single, clarifying question. What is your objective, Ms. Vance? She asked, her eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed on mine. Do you want to negotiate a settlement? Do you want to keep your apartment? Or do you want to win? The question hung in the air, stark and brutal. To win. The words resonated with the cold, hard thing that had taken root in my heart. This was no longer about keeping my home. It was about justice. It was about retribution. It was about making them understand the gravity of their miscalculation. "I want to win," I said, my voice unwavering. "I don't just want to keep my apartment. I want them to regret ever thinking they could take it from me." Anya nodded, a flicker of something that might have been approval in her eyes. "Good," she said, "because fighting this on the merits of the loan document is a fool's errand. You signed it. The document is clear. A court will enforce it. Our only path to victory is leverage. We need to find something they don't want exposed, something that will make the cost of pursuing this claim greater than the benefit of winning it." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Your family, Ms. Vance. Tell me about them, not the curated version they present to the world. The truth. Every family has secrets. Our job is to find them." And so began my new project. The Elara who had compartmentalized her life, who had kept her family and her business dealings separate, was gone. The ruthless, analytical mind that had dissected quarterly reports and hostile takeover bids was now turned upon my own blood. I became a forensic accountant of my family's life, an archaeologist digging through the layers of carefully constructed lies and self-deception. The first casualty of this new war was my sleep. The nights were no longer a time for rest, but for research. My penthouse, once a sanctuary, became a war room. The sprawling glass walls were covered in sticky notes, timelines, and financial charts. The silence was filled with the quiet click of my keyboard as I delved into the digital ghost of my family's life. I started with my father, James Sterling, a man who had built his identity around the concept of integrity. His boutique consulting firm, Sterling Consulting, was his pride and joy, a testament he so often claimed to the power of honest, hard work. He had always been dismissive of my corporate career, of the sharks and vultures I worked with. He was, in his own narrative, a pillar of the community, a man of unimpeachable ethics. I began to peel back the layers of that narrative. I used my corporate research tools, the same ones I used to vet potential acquisition targets, to pull public records, financial statements, and news articles related to Sterling Consulting. I compiled a list of every client he had ever mentioned, every deal he had ever boasted about at family dinners. Then I started making calls. I reached out to former employees of his firm, men and women who had long since moved on. I was careful, discreet. I framed my inquiries as a daughter trying to understand her father's business better, perhaps looking to invest. People are often surprisingly willing to talk, to share old grievances and long-buried resentments, especially when they feel they are speaking in confidence. It was a slow, painstaking process. For weeks, I found nothing but the carefully polished facade my father presented to the world. His business seemed clean, his clients respectable. The frustration was a bitter taste in my mouth. I felt like I was chasing shadows, fighting a war on a battlefield of my own making. But then a crack appeared. A former accountant at Sterling Consulting, a man named Arthur, now retired and living in Florida, agreed to a video call. He was a nervous, bird-like man, but as we spoke, a long-dormant anger began to surface. He spoke of my father's arrogance, of his dismissive attitude towards the people who worked for him. And then he gave me the first piece of the puzzle. "Your father always talked about his diverse client portfolio," Arthur said, his voice thin and reedy. "But it was a lie. For the last 15 years, Sterling Consulting has been propped up by one client, one massive, all-consuming contract. If they ever lost that client, the whole thing would collapse overnight." My heart began to beat faster. This was it, the first vulnerability, the first chink in the armor. My father, the man of integrity, the self-made success story, was living on a knife's edge. His entire empire, the source of his pride and his family's comfortable lifestyle, was dependent on a single, precarious relationship. I spent the next 3 days in a frenzy of research. I cross-referenced every piece of data I had, every financial statement, every public record. And there it was, hidden in plain sight. A single client, a publicly traded tech company called Omni Corp, accounted for nearly 80% of Sterling Consulting's annual revenue. The relationship was so lopsided, so dangerously imbalanced, that it defied all conventional business wisdom. No sane consultant would build their entire practice on such a fragile foundation. I presented my findings to Anya. She listened, her face impassive, but I could see the glint of excitement in her eyes. "This is good," she said. "This is a start. A man with a secret like that is a man with something to lose, but it's not enough. We need more. We need to understand why. Why would a company like Omnicorp put so much faith in a small, boutique firm like Sterling Consulting? What is the nature of this relationship? Find that, Ms. Vance. Find the root of this dependency, and you will find the weapon you need." The hunt was on. The Elara who had once sought her father's approval was now seeking his destruction. The irony was not lost on me. He had taught me to be ruthless, to be relentless, to never back down from a fight. He just never imagined that one day he would be the one in my crosshairs. The awakening was complete. I was no longer the victim in this story. I was the predator, and I was just beginning to enjoy the hunt. The discovery of my father's dependency on Omnicorp was like finding a loose thread on a perfectly woven tapestry. Now, my sole focus was to pull that thread until the entire fabrication unraveled. The question, as Anya had so astutely put it, was why. Why would a major, publicly traded company like Omnicorp maintain such a lopsided, long-term relationship with a small, boutique firm like Sterling Consulting? The answer, I knew, would not be found in public records or financial statements. It would be buried in the human element of the deal, in the relationships and motivations that don't show up on a balance sheet. My investigation shifted from financial forensics to human intelligence. I began by building a detailed profile of Omnicorp, its corporate structure, its key executives, and its history. I spent hours poring over their annual reports, their press releases, their social media presence. I was looking for a connection, a name, a link between the corporate behemoth and my father's small-time operation. My breakthrough came from an unexpected source, my own memory. I cast my mind back through years of tedious family gatherings, of my father holding court, boasting about his work. He rarely mentioned clients by name, always preferring vague, self-aggrandizing pronouncements about his influence and importance. But he loved to talk about the perks of his job, the golf trips, the expensive dinners, the seats in corporate boxes at sporting events. And one name, one recurring character in these stories, began to surface from the depths of my memory. A man named Marcus Thorne. Marcus Thorne was an executive at Omnicorp. According to my father, they were old friends, their relationship built on mutual respect and a shared love of single malt scotch. Thorne was the gatekeeper, the man who had championed Sterling Consulting within the monolithic bureaucracy of Omnicorp. He was the reason, my father had always implied, for the longevity and success of their partnership. I began to dig into Marcus Thorne. He was a senior vice president, a man with a long and seemingly successful career at Omnicorp. He was married, with 2 children in expensive private schools. He lived in a sprawling mansion in the same exclusive suburb as my parents. On the surface, he was the picture of corporate success, a man who had played by the rules and won. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the truth was far messier. The relationship between my father and Marcus Thorne was the key, and I was going to find it. I hired a private investigator, a discreet, ex-journalist with a network of sources and a talent for finding information that people wanted to keep hidden. I gave him a single objective: find out everything there is to know about Marcus Thorne. His finances, his habits, his vices. I wanted to know where he ate, where he drank, where he went when he wasn't at home or at the office. I wanted to know if the picture of a happily married, successful executive was as carefully constructed as my father's image of a man of integrity. While the investigator got to work, I continued my own line of inquiry. I went back to the list of former Sterling Consulting employees, this time with a specific target in mind. I was looking for anyone who had worked closely with the Omnicorp account, anyone who might have witnessed the interactions between my father and Marcus Thorne. I found her in a coffee shop in a trendy, gentrified neighborhood. Her name was Sarah, and she had been my father's executive assistant for over a decade before leaving to start her own business. She was a sharp, intelligent woman who had seen everything and said nothing. She was hesitant to talk at first, wary of dredging up the past, but I was persistent. I didn't threaten or cajole. I simply told her the truth. I told her that my family was trying to take my home, that my father was using a fraudulent loan document to blackmail me, and that I was fighting back. Something in my story, in the raw, unvarnished truth of my desperation, seemed to resonate with her. She had been a victim of my father's arrogance for too long, had watched him take credit for her work, had endured his condescending lectures and his self-important pronouncements. She agreed to tell me what she knew. "Your father and Marcus Thorne weren't just friends," she said, her voice low, her eyes darting around the coffee shop as if she expected my father to materialize out of thin air. "It was more than that. There was a system. Every year around the time the OmniCorp contract was up for renewal, there would be a series of payments. Not to OmniCorp, to a shell corporation. A company with a generic name, registered in a state with lax reporting requirements. I was the one who processed the wire transfers. Your father always said they were for specialized consulting services, but we never received any invoices. It was just a one-way flow of money." My blood turned to ice. Kickbacks. It was the oldest, dirtiest trick in the book. My father, the pillar of integrity, was bribing a corporate executive to maintain his most lucrative contract. It wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. Sarah, emboldened by her own confession, continued. "I always suspected it was illegal, but I was a single mother with a mortgage to pay. I couldn't afford to lose my job. I kept copies of everything, though. The wire transfer confirmations, the emails from your father authorizing the payments. I don't know why. I guess I just thought that one day someone might need them." My heart was pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the weapon Anya had told me to find. This was the leverage that would not only save my home, but would shatter the foundations of my father's life. That evening, the private investigator sent me his report. It was a detailed, sordid account of Marcus Thorne's life. The happily married executive was a facade. He had a gambling problem, a string of bad investments, and a lifestyle that far exceeded his legitimate income. He was a man drowning in debt, a man desperate to maintain the illusion of success. He was a man who would be susceptible to bribery. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. My father's business wasn't built on integrity. It was built on a foundation of lies, of fraud, of criminal conspiracy. He hadn't earned his success. He had bought it. And in doing so, he had handed me the gun and the ammunition I needed to burn his world to the ground. The first crack had become a chasm, and I was ready to push him in. With the evidence of my father's fraud secured, a cold, strategic calm settled over me. I had the weapon, but a weapon is only as effective as the person wielding it. A direct confrontation was tempting, a fantasy I played out in my mind in a dozen different ways. But a premature attack would be messy, unpredictable. It would give him a chance to spin a narrative, to play the victim, to rally my mother and Chloe to his side. No, the first strike had to be precise, surgical, and aimed not at the king, but at the weakest piece on the board. That piece was Liam, Chloe's fiancé, the catalyst for this entire crisis. Up until now, my investigation had been focused on my father, on the source of the family's power and arrogance. But now, I turned my attention to the wedding, the event that was the supposed justification for their outrageous demand. I had my private investigator, a man whose invoices I was now paying with a grim sense of satisfaction, shift his focus from Marcus Thorne to Liam. I wanted to know everything about him, not just his finances, but his character, his history, his vulnerabilities. The report he delivered was even more pathetic than I had imagined. Liam, it turned out, was a hollow man. His family, once wealthy and respected, was a hollowed-out shell, their name the only asset they had left. They were drowning in debt, their sprawling estate mortgaged to the hilt, their investments wiped out by a series of bad bets and a changing economic landscape. Liam wasn't just marrying Chloe for her personality. He was marrying her for the promise of a lifestyle he could no longer afford, for the illusion of wealth and stability that my father so carefully projected. And at the center of that illusion, the glittering prize that would make it all worthwhile, was my penthouse. He was the weak link. He was the one who had the most to lose if the carefully constructed facade of my family's wealth came crumbling down. And he was the one I would use to plant the first seed of doubt, to turn the enemy's camp against itself. I arranged what the intelligence community calls a bump. A chance encounter, seemingly accidental, but meticulously planned. I knew from the investigators' report that Liam played squash every Thursday afternoon at an exclusive club, a pathetic attempt to maintain the trappings of his former life. I had a colleague, a man who owed me a significant favor, arrange for me to be there, ostensibly for a business meeting. I saw him across the polished lobby, looking tanned and fit in his tennis whites, a man utterly oblivious to the storm that was about to break over his carefully curated life. I waited until he was alone, then approached him with a warm, friendly smile. "Liam, isn't it?" I said, my voice a perfect blend of surprise and delight. "I'm Elara, Chloe's sister." He was taken aback, a flicker of unease in his eyes. He had only met me once, at the disastrous family dinner, and I had been the villain of the piece. But my friendly demeanor seemed to disarm him. "Elara," he said, shaking my hand. "Good to see you again." "You too," I said, my smile never wavering. "I'm so sorry about that dinner. It was intense. I hope there are no hard feelings." He mumbled something about family being complicated, his eyes darting around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "I just wanted to say, for what it's worth," I continued, my voice dropping to a more serious, confidential tone, "that I truly hope you and Chloe are happy. She deserves it, especially with everything else that's going on." I let the words hang in the air, a baited hook. His curiosity got the better of his discomfort. "Everything else?" he asked, his brow furrowed with a faint, almost comical look of concern. I sighed, a carefully calibrated performance of a worried older sister. "Oh, you know," I said, waving a dismissive hand. "Family stuff, business things, you know how it is. Dad's been under a lot of pressure lately. That big Omnicorp contract, the one that keeps the lights on, it's not as secure as he likes to pretend. And with the market being what it is." I let my voice trail off, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of his own financial insecurity. I looked him in the eye, my expression one of sincere, sisterly concern. "I probably shouldn't be saying this, but you're about to be family, and I just think you should know what you're getting into. My father, he puts on a good show, but the business isn't what it used to be. Things are precarious." I watched his face as the implications of my words began to dawn on him. The easy, confident smile was gone, replaced by a look of dawning horror. He was a man who had bet everything on a sure thing, only to be told that the horse was lame. "I have to run," I said, my voice bright and cheerful again, the performance complete. "But it was great to see you, Liam, and I'll see you at the wedding, of course. I wouldn't miss it for the world." I walked away, not looking back, the echo of his stunned silence a symphony in my ears. I had not revealed my hand. I had not made a single threat. I had simply told him a version of the truth, a carefully curated version designed to prey on his deepest fears. I had poisoned the well. I had turned his dream of a secure financial future into a nightmare of potential ruin. Let him go back to Chloe, I thought, a cold smile on my lips. Let him ask her the questions I had planted in his mind. Let the doubt fester. Let the fear grow. The alliance between my sister and her fortune-hunting fiancé was built on a foundation of lies, and I had just lit the fuse that would blow it all apart. The meeting with Sarah, my father's former assistant, was the turning point. She was the keeper of the keys, the one person who could turn my suspicions into cold, hard proof. We met in a quiet, anonymous hotel bar, a place where secrets could be exchanged without fear of being overheard. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she slid a slim, unmarked USB drive across the table. "I don't know if I should be doing this," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a long-suppressed desire for justice. "He could ruin me." "He could ruin me, too," I said, my voice low and steady. "That's what this is about. He's trying to take my home, Sarah. The one thing I've ever built for myself. You're not just helping me. You're helping everyone he's ever stepped on to get to where he is." Her resolve hardened. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement of our shared enemy. I took the USB drive, the small, plastic object feeling heavier than it had any right to be. It was the arsenal Anya had told me to build, the weapon that would win the war. Back in the sterile quiet of my penthouse, I plugged the drive into my laptop. The contents were meticulously organized, a testament to Sarah's quiet efficiency. There were folders for each year, each containing scanned copies of wire transfer confirmations, internal emails, and falsified invoices. It was a digital roadmap of my father's criminal enterprise. I spent the next 2 days immersed in the data, cross-referencing the dates of the payments with the renewal dates of the OmniCorp contract. The pattern was undeniable. Every year, like clockwork, a substantial sum of money would be transferred from a Sterling Consulting account to a shell corporation controlled by Marcus Thorne. And every year, shortly thereafter, the OmniCorp contract would be renewed, my father's firm securing another year of inflated fees and unearned prestige. It was all there, the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof of a long-running conspiracy of bribery and fraud. I had him. I had them both. But the evidence, as damning as it was only one piece of the puzzle. I needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy, to anticipate my father's every move, to leave him with no escape route, no plausible deniability. I turned my attention back to OmniCorp. The kickbacks were the how, but I still needed to understand the why. Why was Marcus Thorne willing to risk his career, his freedom for my father's money? The investigator's report had given me the answer: debt, a gambling problem, a lifestyle that was a lie. I decided to take a calculated risk. I arranged a meeting with a contact I had at a major financial newspaper, a journalist with a reputation for tenacity and a deep understanding of corporate malfeasance. I didn't give him the whole story. I didn't mention my father or my family or the Penthouse. I simply gave him a tip. I told him to look into Marcus Thorne, to scrutinize his finances, to ask questions about how a senior vice president at a publicly traded company could afford a lifestyle that so far outstripped his salary. It was a shot in the dark, a calculated gamble that the journalist's own ambition and curiosity would do the work for me. And it paid off. A week later, a small, almost insignificant article appeared on the newspaper's website. It was a carefully worded piece, full of innuendo and suggestive questions, but the message was clear. Marcus Thorne was living beyond his means, and there were questions about the source of his wealth. The article was a spark in a tinderbox. It set off a chain reaction within OmniCorp, a company pathologically averse to bad press. An internal investigation was launched. Thorne, I knew, would be under a microscope. His carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. With the pieces in place, I prepared my final attack. It was not enough to simply expose my father. I wanted to do it in a way that would be public, humiliating, and utterly devastating. I wanted to strip him of not just his business, but his pride, his reputation, his very identity. The wedding, the event that had been the catalyst for this whole sordid affair, would now be the stage for its dramatic conclusion. It was the perfect venue. It would be a captive audience of his friends, his colleagues, his community. It would be the one place where the facade of his integrity was most important, and therefore, the one place where its destruction would be most complete. I spent a week meticulously planning the execution. I hired a freelance audio-visual technician, a young, ambitious kid with a talent for hacking into corporate presentation systems. I gave him a simple task: to gain remote access to the AV system at the wedding venue. He was to be on standby, waiting for my signal. I prepared a presentation. It was a masterpiece of corporate demolition. It began with a simple timeline of Sterling Consulting's revenue, showing the dramatic, unnatural dependency on the OmniCorp contract. It then moved to the evidence from Sarah's USB drive. The wire transfers, the emails, the fake invoices, all laid out in a clear, undeniable sequence. It concluded with a series of screenshots from the financial newspaper's article about Marcus Thorne, and a final, damning slide that summarized the entire conspiracy in 3 simple words: bribery, fraud, conspiracy. I rehearsed my speech in the empty silence of my penthouse, my voice calm and steady, my words precise and cutting. I was no longer the emotional, wounded daughter. I was the CEO of my own life, delivering a hostile takeover bid for my own freedom. The night before the wedding, I looked at the arsenal I had assembled. The USB drive with its damning evidence. The presentation that would be the instrument of my father's ruin. the remote control that would give me control of the narrative. It was a formidable collection of weapons, all aimed at the heart of my family's hypocrisy. There was a moment, a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of doubt, of the old Elara, the one who craved her family's love, who yearned for their approval. But then I thought of the demand letter, of the cold, calculated betrayal, of the years of sacrifice they had so casually dismissed. And the doubt was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. They had started this war, but I was the one who was going to end it. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect, cloudless sky that seemed to mock the storm I was about to unleash. I spent the morning in a state of serene, almost unnerving calm. I had a light breakfast. I did yoga on my terrace, the city sprawling beneath me, a silent witness to my impending victory. I took a long, hot bath, the steam a welcome cloak of anonymity. I chose my dress with the care of a general choosing his uniform for a decisive battle. It was a deep, emerald green, a color of wealth and power and quiet confidence. It was elegant, understated, and utterly unassailable. My hair was styled in a sleek, severe chignon, my makeup flawless, my expression a carefully constructed mask of placid neutrality. When I arrived at the church, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the low hum of polite conversation. I saw them immediately, my family, clustered together near the entrance, a portrait of smug satisfaction. My father, resplendent in his morning suit, was greeting guests with the booming, self-assured bonhomie of a man who believed he had won. My mother, a vision in pale blue, was fluttering around him, her face a mask of maternal pride. And Chloe, the blushing bride, was a confection of white lace and diamonds, her face aglow with the naive, unearned happiness of a child who has always been given everything she has ever wanted. They saw me approach, and a subtle shift occurred in their dynamic, a flicker of surprise, of wariness, of a shared, unspoken question. They had expected me to be broken, to be defeated, to be a ghost at this feast of their own making. They had not expected this version of me, this calm, confident woman who met their gaze without flinching. "Elara," my mother said, her voice a little too bright, a little too brittle. "You came." "Of course," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." I turned to Chloe, a warm, genuine smile on my lips. "You look beautiful, Chloe, truly." She seemed taken aback by my sincerity, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. She had expected a fight, a scene, a last, desperate plea. She did not know how to react to this calm, gracious version of her sister. I handed her a small, elegantly wrapped gift. It was a pair of antique sapphire earrings, a family heirloom that my grandmother had left to me, the eldest granddaughter. It was a gesture of peace, of reconciliation, a white flag offered before the slaughter. It was a lie, of course, but it was a beautiful, convincing one. "Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue," I said, my voice a soft murmur. "I thought you should have them." Chloe, a creature of sentiment and shiny things, was momentarily won over. She hugged me, a brief, awkward embrace that felt like a betrayal of the war that was about to be waged. I moved through the pre-ceremony reception with a practiced, effortless grace. I greeted my aunts and uncles, my cousins, my father's business associates. I was a study in perfect composure, a daughter playing her part in the family drama with an Oscar-worthy performance. I could feel their eyes on me, the whispers, the speculation. They all knew about the fight, about the demand for the penthouse. They were all waiting for the inevitable breakdown, the emotional outburst that would confirm their narrative of me as the unstable, work-obsessed, selfish older sister. I gave them nothing. I was a placid lake, my surface calm and undisturbed, hiding the raging currents beneath. My control was my armor, my serenity my sword. They mistook my silence for surrender, my composure for defeat. They had no idea that I was not a guest at this wedding. I was its executioner. The ceremony itself was a surreal experience. I sat in the front pew, a silent, watchful presence, as my father walked my sister down the aisle, his face a mask of paternal pride. I listened to the vows, the promises of love and fidelity, the pronouncements of a shared future. It was all a sham, a beautiful, expensive lie, and I was the only one who knew it. As Liam, his face pale and strained, slid the ring onto my sister's finger, his eyes met mine for a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment. I saw in them not love, not joy, but a flicker of fear, of a dawning, terrible understanding. The seed of doubt I had planted had taken root. He was beginning to realize that the foundation of his new life was built on sand. The reception was held at a lavish country club, a place of manicured lawns and quiet, old-money elegance. The ballroom was a sea of pastel dresses and dark suits, the air filled with the clinking of champagne glasses and the low murmur of polite, meaningless conversation. I took my seat at the family table, a silent, observant predator in a den of unsuspecting prey. I ate my salmon, I drank my champagne, I smiled and nodded and played my part. The tension was a palpable thing, a coiled snake in the center of the table. My family watched me, their conversations stilted, their smiles forced. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the inevitable confrontation. They had no idea that I was not going to drop a shoe. I was going to drop a bomb. The calm before the storm. It was a beautiful, terrible thing. And as my father, flushed with champagne and self-satisfaction, rose to give his speech, I knew that the storm was about to break. My father stood at the podium, a glass of champagne in his hand, his face flushed with a mixture of pride and alcohol. He was in his element, the benevolent patriarch, the master of ceremonies, the king of his own small, self-satisfied kingdom. The large screen behind him, which had been displaying a saccharine slideshow of Chloe and Liam's courtship, went dark, a blank canvas waiting for his masterpiece of self-congratulation. "Friends, family," he began, his voice booming through the ballroom. "Today we are here to celebrate a union of two beautiful young people, Chloe and Liam, who are embarking on a new life together. But we are also here to celebrate something more. We are here to celebrate family, to celebrate legacy, to celebrate the values that have guided our family for generations: integrity, hard work, and an unwavering commitment to each other." I felt a cold, contemptuous smile touch my lips. The hypocrisy was so pure, so undiluted, that it was almost beautiful. He spoke of integrity as if he were its inventor, of legacy as if it were a birthright he had earned through honest labor. As he continued his rambling, self-aggrandizing monologue, I reached into my evening bag and took out the small, discreet remote control. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. This was the moment. The culmination of weeks of planning, of sleepless nights, of a cold, calculated rage that had been simmering just beneath the surface of my carefully constructed composure. With a single, deliberate press of a button, I hijacked the presentation. The screen behind my father flickered to life, but it was not a picture of a smiling Chloe or a dashing Liam that appeared. It was a crisp, clear, undeniable image of a bank transfer confirmation. A transfer of a substantial sum of money from Sterling Consulting to a numbered company in a Caribbean tax haven. My father, oblivious, continued to speak. "I have always believed that a man's worth is measured not by his wealth, but by his word, by the promises he keeps, by the example he sets for his children." Another image flashed onto the screen, a scanned copy of an email from my father to Marcus Thorne, its subject line a damningly casual, "Ray, annual bonus." The body of the email was a thinly veiled discussion of the kickback payment, a digital handshake that sealed their dirty deal. A murmur went through the crowd. People were turning their heads, their eyes shifting from my father to the screen behind him. A look of confusion, of dawning unease, began to spread through the ballroom. My father, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, faltered. He turned, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw the evidence of his own criminality projected for all to see. The slideshow continued, a relentless, undeniable narrative of his fraud. The timeline of Sterling Consulting's revenue, the lopsided dependency on OmniCorp, the series of wire transfers, the falsified invoices. It was all there, a digital confession broadcast in high definition. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. I picked up a spare microphone from the table, its cool weight a comfort in my hand. The room fell silent, a shocked, expectant hush. All eyes were on me. "My father is right," I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the ballroom's sound system. He is a man who believes in legacy. And this, I said, gesturing to the screen behind him, is his true legacy. A legacy of bribery, of fraud, of a life built on a foundation of lies. I turned my gaze to my father, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. You wanted my home, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. You tried to blackmail me for it. You used a fraudulent loan document to threaten me, to try and force me to give up the one thing I have ever built for myself. You did this because you needed it. You needed it to secure a fortune-hunting husband for your daughter, a man who is only here because he believes you are a wealthy and powerful man. I turned my gaze to Liam, his face pale, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. I'm afraid you've been misled, Liam. The man you see before you is not a pillar of the community. He is a criminal. And his business, the one you were counting on to fund your comfortable new life, is about to cease to exist. I could see the executives from OmniCorp who were seated at a table near the front, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. One of them was already on his phone, his voice a low, urgent murmur. The house of cards was collapsing. I looked at my sister, her face a crumpled mess of tears and confusion. I'm sorry, Chloe, I said, and for the first time I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. You were a pawn in their game, but you were a willing one. You were so blinded by your own entitlement, by your belief that you deserved a life you had not earned, that you never once stopped to question the cost. Finally, I turned my gaze back to my father, who was standing at the podium, a broken, pathetic figure, his face ashen, his eyes empty. You wanted a legacy, Dad, I said, my voice a final, damning judgment. Here it is. I placed the microphone back on the table, the soft thud a final punctuation mark on the destruction of my family. I turned and walked out of the ballroom, my head held high, the stunned, absolute silence of the room a symphony in my ears. I did not look back. There was nothing left to see. The drive back to the city was a blur. I don't remember the traffic, the streetlights, the familiar landmarks. I remember only the profound, deafening silence in my own mind. The rage that had fueled me for weeks was gone, burned away in the crucible of my final, public act of defiance. The grief that had been a cold, hard knot in my chest had dissolved. I was empty, but it was not a desolate emptiness. It was a clean, quiet, and absolute peace. I stepped into my penthouse, the cool, conditioned air a welcome balm on my skin. The city lights glittered outside my window, a familiar, comforting presence, but something had changed. The view was the same, but I was different. The penthouse was no longer a fortress, a defensive position against a hostile world. It was simply home. The fallout from the wedding was, as I had predicted, catastrophic. The story was a brief, spectacular scandal, a juicy piece of gossip for the city's elite, and then, like all scandals, it faded from the headlines, replaced by the next salacious story. But the consequences for my family were real and lasting. My father was under federal investigation for fraud and bribery. His business, Sterling Consulting, was gone, its assets frozen, its reputation shattered. Marcus Thorne was fired from OmniCorp, his career over, his name a cautionary tale in the corporate world. The last I heard, he was selling off his assets to pay his legal bills and his gambling debts. Chloe's wedding, the event that had been the catalyst for my war, ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. The marriage was annulled a week after the disastrous reception, a quiet, humiliating end to her fairy tale romance. Liam, it turned out, had no stomach for a life without a trust fund. He disappeared from her life as quickly as he had entered it, a ghost of a future that had never been real. My phone was a constant barrage of vitriol and desperation. My mother left a string of tearful, hysterical voicemails, arias of maternal betrayal and wounded pride. My father sent a single, terse text message, a pathetic attempt at a threat that I deleted without a second thought. Chloe sent a long, rambling email, a confused mixture of anger, self-pity, and a dawning, terrible understanding of the world she had been so blissfully ignorant of. I deleted them all without listening, without reading. Their voices had no power over me anymore. I was alone, but for the first time in my life, I was not lonely. I had severed the toxic limb of my family, and in doing so, I had cauterized a wound that had been festering for years. The silence in my life was no longer a defensive measure, but a positive presence, a space for my own thoughts, my own desires, my own self. I had a final meeting with Anya Sharma. We met in her office, the same minimalist, art-filled loft where our journey had begun. She greeted me with a rare, genuine smile. "You did it, Elara," she said, her voice a mixture of admiration and professional satisfaction. "You won." "We won," I corrected her. "I couldn't have done it without you." She waved a dismissive hand. "I just gave you the map. You were the one who had the courage to walk the path." We settled the final details of her invoice, a substantial sum that I paid without a moment's hesitation. It was the price of my freedom, and it was a bargain. As I was leaving, she asked me a final question. Was it worth it? I thought for a moment, my mind replaying the events of the past few months. The betrayal, the anger, the cold, calculated rage. The destruction of my family, the public humiliation of my father, the shattering of my sister's illusions. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and unwavering. "It was worth it." I walked out of her office and into the bright, clear afternoon. The city was alive with the hum of a million different lives, a million different stories. And for the first time, I felt like I was a part of it, not just an observer from a glass tower. That evening, I stood on my terrace, a glass of wine in my hand, the city lights spread out before me like a carpet of fallen stars. The penthouse was quiet, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind. It was my sanctuary, my kingdom, my home. And it was mine, not just because I had paid for it with money, but because I had paid for it with courage. The courage to fight for it. The courage to burn down the world that had tried to take it from me. The courage to be free. The price of my peace had been high. But as I stood there, bathed in the glow of my hard-won kingdom, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that I would pay it again. 1,000 times over.